Welcome, folks, to the FDA update, AR and VR regulatory science and related special considerations talk. Where we're looking forward to an exceptional talk today. We've got a stellar panel of speakers and an incredible moderator that'll make this one of probably the best talks of the season. Just as some background before we get started on the talk, I want to tell you a little bit about MedVR. You came to hear from the FDA, so we won't take too long on that, but I think it's a good start. We are the MedVR Bootcamp and Accelerator, where we spun out of the MIT Media Lab AR/VR hackathons that we ran at extreme scale. We're seeking to increase the yield on prototypes becoming products, and the products becoming companies. We're focused on medical extended reality. The Bootcamp and Accelerator are in progress, and what they're designed to do is exactly address the yield of producing exceptional prototypes. We also run regular webinars like this one. This is a little different in that it's focused on the FDA side of things, but it fits very nicely because our talks are about the journey of the innovator, and we like to what our community likes is the stories about the first idea, the inspiration, testing the idea, doing the research, collecting the evidence, and building a prototype. And all our talks are recorded, so you can come back and go through them, which I think you'd find pretty interesting. We'd love for you to sign up for our newsletter through our website, and we'll let you know when the next talks are. Which I think you'll find useful. They cover a diversity of fields in medical XR. And on that note, just a couple of housekeeping points on this. We have two speakers. The talks are about 20 minutes each, so we'll be up towards the hour, depending upon where you are. It might be 1 o'clock in Boston, or it might be 7 o'clock in Heidelberg, or 10 o'clock in California, but up to the hour. We'll have time for more questions from the audience, so stay tuned for the Q&A session. You'll note on the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A icon. That's the chat to introduce your Q&A question, and then there's also a chat, and that's just for the people in the audience to talk to one another as well. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Lars Riedemann. He's a consulting neurologist at the University of Heidelberg Hospital, which is Germany's version of Mass General in terms of scope and expanse and influence. And he's also the director of the Shift Medical Conference that works on the topic of XR in healthcare. He's uniquely experienced as a physician scientist, trained in neurology and biomedical engineering. He's had experience both here in the United States at Harvard and Mass General and Harvard Medical School, which makes his perspective unique. And he has both worked across the field in bioengineering as well as pharma. And on that note, I'll turn things over to Lars and look forward to listen and sit back and listen to the talk.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the nice introduction. I don't want to waste too much time, so I would immediately jump into introducing our two fabulous guests from the FDA. Today, Peter Yang and Ryan Beams will give a presentation each. And Peter will start with this seminar. And Peter has a background also in bioengineering, and specifically in tissue engineering and regenerative medicine. And he obtained a Ph.D. at the very distinguished Georgia Tech. After the Ph.D., he worked at the FDA, where he is currently overseeing and working in the Novo program, which I personally find a very interesting program at the FDA, where Peter is not only looking at tissue engineering, but pretty much everything which is de novo in the market and needs some serious assessment. And welcome, Peter. Peter is accompanied by Ryan Beams, and Ryan shares a little bit of his background with my background. He is an expert in optical imaging. He is an optical physicist. He worked in a lot of different modalities of imaging, and he is really spearheading also the XR initiative and everything which is related to XR and regulation at the FDA. So I'm really honored to be able to host you here and be your moderator. And let's dive deep in. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you for participating in this talk. Let me share my screen and get things going here. My name is Peter Yang. I'm the program lead. Thanks for Lars for the introduction. I'm the program lead for the de novo program in the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality at the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. And I want to acknowledge Jason Ryans, who's not with us, but who helped work on this slide deck. We've given this talk previously. I've adapted it here for this presentation. Please enjoy and let me know if you have any questions. And certainly we can answer them in the Q&A time. So what I want to do is I want to just present what I'm going to briefly talk about this morning, or this afternoon from my perspective, which is to basically give you a high-level overview of how FDA reviews medical devices with special considerations that are relevant to AR, VR technologies, and how we think about those at FDA. So looking at the pre-market side, before something can go into the market, FDA will permit the device to be marketed upon reviewing data and information about its benefits and risks for a given medical device. And then also talking about some of the post-market authorities that we have to ensure that these devices remain safe and effective. So again, high-level overviews here, but with special call-outs to specifics for AR and VR technologies. All right, so let's start with the pre-market side here. So just to give you some terminology, for a medical device to be distributed and marketed in the United States, FDA reviews safety and effectiveness data for the device and weighs the probable benefits of the device against the probable risks of device use. And based off of that evaluation and its analysis, FDA decides whether to permit that device to be legally marketed. So that's the kind of general authority where someone comes in, provides data, we evaluate that data, and then allow it to be on the market. So when it comes to benefits and risks, at a very high level, we think about benefits are not just relevant to clinical improvements and what a clinician is seeing in terms of patient improvement. It can also be in the form of lower risks. Essentially, a lower risk device has increased benefit because it's safer to use. More accurate diagnoses, if the device is an in vitro diagnostic device or some kind of other diagnostic tool, obviously, a more accurate diagnosis is a benefit for patients, and shorter or easier procedures, right? And this is something where you can imagine AR or VR playing a role, especially for clinician use, to make a procedure easier to perform, to allow, enhanced visualization, maybe decrease procedure time and that sort of thing. When it comes to asking questions about those benefits, we ask questions such as, what's the likelihood of experiencing those benefits? Is there a particular subpopulation or a particular duration of effect? How long do the benefits last? Are there benefits for healthcare professionals or caregivers? Is it easier for a healthcare professional to perform a particular procedure? Is it easier for a caregiver with a patient that may be vulnerable to provide benefit to that patient, to take care of that patient? Those are questions that we'll always ask about those benefits so that we have those benefits in context. When it comes to risks, obviously we're thinking, at a very broad level here, we're thinking about potential for serious injury or impairment or even death related to the device. I think probably a little bit less likely for AR, VR technologies, but certainly those are factors and things that we think about. Adverse events and complications that don't result in serious injury, but are nevertheless unexpected or harmful, right? So sometimes there are adverse events which we can foresee based on the device technology, but sometimes there are events which really only come out in testing. Things which, really you're looking at clinical data with the device or home use with the device to identify some of these risks. And there may be other things like the medical device malfunctioning, so it may not be assembled or built correctly, and so you may not get the performance that you're expecting, or you may have other issues with function. There may be, maybe a complex device which requires additional training. It may be difficult to use. There may be human factors issues as far as whether or not it's intuitive for a user, a caregiver, somebody with more or less experience to be able to use that device. And then along with all of those elements, obviously questions about probability, right? Who's likely to experience this, duration, how long is someone going to experience this risk or is at risk for this for a particular issue? All of those things factor into FDA's estimation as well. We also take into account additional factors in our benefit risk thinking. And one of those that we've made a recent effort in recent years is patient perspectives. And I kind of like to separate that into two different categories here. One is looking at patient preferences. So that's looking at studies that look at what patients may prefer, because patients are not a monolith, right? Not a monolith. Not everyone prefers the same kind of device. A device may have a different benefit risk profile relative to a different device. And so different patients will have different considerations on what benefits and risks they will accept. Some patients may accept a device with greater risk that carries with it inherently a greater benefit. Some patients may have different experiences there, and there's going to be different subpopulations and different groups, which you really need a patient preference study or the kind of information to kind of tease out. And then on the other side is also patient-reported outcomes. So looking at metrics and measurements that are important to patients, as opposed to outcomes that are important to healthcare professionals, right? So you could think of activities of daily living, quality of life kinds of elements, things that patients are going to clue in on. This is for me, in my daily life, doing this kind of activity is really important to me. It may be less relevant to a clinician, but it may be really, really important for a patient. And so patient-reported outcomes, in addition to clinical reported outcomes or clinician-reported outcomes, that is something that FDA considers as well. Obviously, some outcomes can only be reported by patients, right? Things like vision or pain, those kinds of things, or you're really asking for a patient to tell you. But if you think about, say, a pediatric population, that requires an extra degree of separation between you and the patient because there's a caregiver, right? There's someone who's going to interpret the information that's being provided by a child. for example. And so, that's going to add an extra dimension to how we think about those outcomes. Uncertainty. What is the inherent uncertainty that the data provided represents what will occur in the real world? You can talk about it in uncertainty terms or confidence terms, and that depends on a lot of different elements, including the quality and strength of evidence based off of the non-clinical and the clinical information that we have, depending on how that study is designed. If someone gives the device to their brother and their brother really likes it, that may not be really high quality evidence to support marketing the device in the United States. The extent of the public health need. What is the public health need for this device? What does this device bring to the table relative to other devices? Looking at the landscape and how this a particular device will fit into that. Clinical judgment. How does a clinician assess the inherent limitations of the data that they have, based off of their clinical experience and what they believe will be beneficial to patients. And then we also always assess things like the ability to mitigate the risks associated with the device. What can we do to control the risks that we've identified for the product, whether or not that's labeling, which I'm going to get to on the next slide, or other kinds of ways which we can try to control for some of those risks. And then another thing that factors into our questions about uncertainty is, can we get post-market data? What are the schemes or the mechanisms through which we can understand how the device is performing in the real world, outside of a controlled environment like you might get in a clinical study? That all factors into our uncertainty about the device that we're reviewing. Yeah, so labeling. So obviously, most devices come with labeling, right? Information provided to help users understand how to use a device safely and correctly. And that can be either from a healthcare professional standpoint or even from a patient or caregiver standpoint. That can often include training information, right? You think of instructions for use or pictures, stickers or other kinds of information on how to use a device. Labeling can also be informative. It can help inform users of benefits and risks of a particular device, help them understand what they're going to get out of it. But of course, it has limitations, right? How many people read the labeling or the instructions for use before they just start going in to their product and trying to use it, right? So relying on labeling to solve all of your problems is not necessarily the best way, right? Doesn't have, is not necessarily practical. So labeling cannot completely mitigate the risks of the device use. And I guess the prototypical example is, you're sort of holding it wrong, right? That's a phrase which is entered in with respect to cell phones. And, just saying that, well, you're holding it wrong and here's how you should use it, providing that in instructions, doesn't necessarily mitigate the problems with the device, right? Sometimes the solution is to design the device better such that it doesn't have that problem. And so those are factors which FDA will take into consideration when thinking about whether to permit a device to be marketed. All right, so briefly highlighting some of the ways that companies can actually get through the FDA in the United States and get their device marketed. And I want to talk about sort of two main categories. This isn't exhaustive. There are other ways of getting a device to market, but the two main ways, probably for AR and VR technologies that are most relevant, are the 510K process and the de novo process, which I manage. So for the 510K process, this is really where there's a device out into the market and someone comes along with a device that's similar to that is performing in a similar way or doing a similar thing, but they're simply adding AR or VR as a capability. You can imagine replacing a screen with something that would provide you information on the side. So the sort of general intended use of the device is not changing, general technology is not changing, but they're adding the AR, VR as a technology. And so in that case, what they'll do is they'll provide data to help demonstrate that that device is as safe and effective as similar devices and get onto the market that way. So they're saying, hey, I'm just like this other one. I've added VR as a capability, AR, VR as a capability, but it's not influencing the overall safety effectiveness profile. And so that's what we call substantial equivalence. That's called the 510K process. If the device is really novel, where it's really employing AR, VR technology in a novel way that's really advancing the field, doing something different to where it's not really comparable to other kinds of devices because of maybe it introduces a new kind of risk because of the way that it's employing AR or VR technology, then that's when somebody would submit a de novo request. And the regulatory pathway is such there that they're still providing, robust data to FDA, but FDA is trying to determine whether general and special controls, and the basic way to understand that is legal requirements for the device, can be put in place to ensure reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So not saying that this is as safe and effective as a device that already exists on the market, but saying from first principles, this device is safe and effective. And then we set up a regulatory framework to ensure that future devices can then be called substantially equivalent to that device that's reviewed in the de novo context. So again, regardless of the context of that submission, we're going to provide robust, we're going to ask for robust testing, whether that's bench testing with the device, clinical testing, real world evidence with the device of high quality, or human factors or things like usability testing to ensure that that device is safe and effective. We have various programs in general, and I'm going to speed through this. I want to be cognizant of time and give Ryan the opportunity to to provide his slides as well. But we have different programs for ensuring timely access to devices. So we have a breakthrough devices program, which is really intended to help reduce the time to market for more effective treatments or diagnosis of life-threatening or debilitating diseases or conditions. We also have a program that is for safer technologies. So where maybe the effectiveness is really staying the same, but the device is safer overall. It's going to improve the safety there, and that's where we're trying to improve that access for patients by trying to help speed up the time to market for those kinds of products. All right, let's jump in briefly to special considerations for AR and VR technologies. So one thing I want to touch on when testing medical devices and preparing those devices for marketing is informed consent and making sure that patients understand the benefits of a new AR or VR technology, but also about risks and uncertainties. I think informed consent is always really challenging for new technologies because I think patients have perhaps unrealistic expectations sometimes of devices because they're new. Oh, it's AR, VR. Well, therefore, it'll be the best thing since sliced bread. And maybe it will be, but that's what you're trying to find out in the context of a clinical study. And so there may be the need for additional safeguards, especially for children who are using AR, VR devices and helping to understand, hey, we don't actually know all the risks of this device for children. And so we're trying to take additional safeguards there, trying to provide additional ways to report any issues that crop up when patients are testing these devices. When it comes to benefits and risks of AR and VR technologies, these are some of the things which you probably already are thinking about for your products. And so when it comes to benefits, obviously they can be used at home, right? Huge thing. Don't have to go into the office. Don't have to go to a hospital and be able to do this in the comfort of your own home. That has huge benefits, especially for underserved populations, patients that can't get easy access to medical care, children. To be able to use those devices at home, it will be a huge, huge benefit. It also can enhance clinical preparation or performance, right? So thinking not from a home use, sort of patient perspective, but thinking from a, hospital use clinician perspective, using AR, VR technologies to do things like enhance surgery technique or make for safer procedures, those kinds of things could be huge benefits for patients as well. Of course, there are risks, mostly when it comes to usability, whether or not AR, VR technology actually improves, is usable by the patients. They understand the software interface, they can use it appropriately. And then obviously things related generally to AR, VR, including dizziness or fatigue or effects on vision. One thing we want to highlight here is that, FDA is not interested in regulating a device because it exists, right? We're really interested in looking at safety and effectiveness data when it's really used for a medical purpose. And so oftentimes you'll find that AR, VR technologies are running on some consumer grade hardware, right? So you have a special medical software, but it's running on an Oculus or I guess a Meta Quest, right? Or a Samsung Gear VR headset. We do have a policy that kind of outlines where we choose to focus our regulatory authority, really trying to look at safety and effectiveness and not trying to bring the full brunt of FDA sort of enforcement to bear on commercially available products that are used for, games or other kinds of applications. All right, and then briefly just to cover how we think about post-market regulation. So after a device is on the market, we can think about post-market studies to looking at the device in the post-market. We have ways for companies to report medical device adverse events, both by healthcare professionals and patients. Like if you have a problem with the medical device right now, you could report it to FDA. We have ways of capturing that information. Inspections and recalls, active surveillance, obviously, and then we always do ongoing research and surveillance of medical journals, electronic health records, patient registries, and so on. So post-market studies are really used where we need to understand some of the long-term risks with the device after it's out on the market. And there may be some need to look at longitudinal risks with higher severity, unanticipated issues, other kinds of rare things which you're not going to get in a clinical study, and you really need to look at the post-market to capture that kind of information. In certain circumstances, we actually have the authority to mandate that a device be studied in the post-market arena. For example, in patients at risk of serious illness or injury and vulnerable patient populations. And that's where you can use what we call the Section 522 study to mandate studies for AR to VR devices, especially if they're used in children. We also have other ways of post-market surveillance. Again, medical device reporting, where you, as a personal person in your own life with medical devices, can report issues to the FDA directly. We also look at patient registries related to professional medical societies, as well as other post-market studies that industry may conduct or academic medical institutions. All right, I probably took longer. I wasn't timing myself, but I probably took longer than I should have, but let me turn it over to Ryan to give his talk as well, and then we can answer questions there.
Thank you.
Just a quick housekeeping note. The chat is disabled. It looks like it's from an update from Zoom, and I've re-enabled it, but it would mean restarting the webinar. The good news is the Q&A chat is working, so please add your questions there.
All right, let me just get into presentation mode. All right, should look correct now. Let me just move this bar out of the way. All right, so thank you very much for the great introduction, Peter. I really appreciate it. I think that did a great job laying the landscape. So what I'm going to talk about is more specific to AR/VR and some of the regulatory science issues that we've been working on and that the community at large has been involved with. Okay, quick disclaimer, we'll click over that. So as we have, I think everyone on this call is probably pretty familiar with, these devices are being explored for a wide range of applications. So this is just a graphical way to show that. So there's things ranging from visualization, rehab, interoperative, and below are the 510K numbers for devices that have gone through the 510K process that Peter just talked about. And really what this is supposed to highlight is that there's a lot of different ways these devices are being used, and trying to understand from a regulatory science standpoint and evaluation standpoint, different questions come up depending on how it's used. So here's just a quick table that I put together of not an exhaustive list, but some of the devices that have gone through clearance. And I think this is helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it can be a little bit difficult, I think, to track down which devices do and do not have AR and VR aspects. And then the other part I want to highlight, well, a couple of things, is you'll see that there's a huge variation in product code. So that's giving you an idea of what kind of specialties and indications for use they're for. And then I've added on the side my own little pictographs to show kind of that these are being used for very different applications. You have a mixture of AR and VR. And then, as we also heard from Peter, these are being used both by the patient and the doctor. And the questions that come up depending on which of those different use groups is engaging with the device changes, again, some of the questions that come up. So just to highlight a few of the reasons why I think this is an interesting space to work in from a regulatory science standpoint. Again, we have a huge range of indications for use. The platforms are constantly changing. So most companies are using off-the-shelf hardware, and that technology is evolving very, very quickly. And so as a result, what these devices are capable of and how the technology is performing changes very fast. And so this is, I think, introduces a challenge for instance, for the standards community and for the evaluation science side to try to keep up with that rapid changing technology developments, and also to try to make methods available that are accessible to smaller companies that maybe don't have all the expertise on the hardware characterization. So on this slide, I'm just going to highlight a couple of kind of the broad categories of performance questions that we think about when looking at these devices. So you can slice this up in a couple different ways. One way you can think about it is from a technology standpoint. So if we, for instance, are thinking about AR, VR in general, we might be interested in the image quality, tracking performance, the latency, usability, and human factors. And then particularly for AR, there might be additional questions that come up because you have a view of the real world at the same time. So for a surgical application, there might be image registration, tool tracking, and some additional technological questions. You can also slice it differently and look at the application. So in this case, you're kind of taking these same technological questions and then thinking which ones are relevant for a particular application. So if I just want to visualize something, and we're not going to use it in an operating room, we're not using it near a patient, then the types of testing that might be needed could be a little bit lower than the kinds of questions that will come up for, say, an intraoperative use where there's a patient involved. And then, of course, for very different applications like therapeutics, again, there's a whole different set of questions which you can kind of think about as being drawn from these technological buckets. So on this slide, just want to quickly highlight, there is a lot of work being done in the standards communities. It's challenging to keep pace with how quickly the technologies are developing, but I did want to highlight some work that's being done in the IEC, primarily looking at image quality. There's some ISO standards as well, looking at the usability, and again, on some of the display requirements. And then recently there was an ICDM document that came up, which basically takes some of the testing methods in IEC and flushes them out in more detail with step-by-step procedures for how to do them. And then there's also a number of IEEE programs that are in process. Okay, and then next I want to highlight just some of the efforts that we're taking within the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories within our Medical Extended Reality Research Program. And so what we're trying to do with this program is basically, so we've highlighted that there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of challenges. What can we do to develop better test methods to try to address some of these evaluation challenges? So when devices come to market, we know how to evaluate them. We can make those test methods publicly available, and then companies can use them for the evaluation as well. So broad categories, we can take this and kind of split it into bench testing methods, and then trying to understand what happens when you take the device out of the bench test and put it on a user. So for instance, motion tracking and looking at particular applications. So now I'm just going to highlight a few of more on the image quality standpoint, because as Lars mentioned, I'm an optics guy, so those are the ones that come up for me. Some of the types of image quality questions that come up. So here's just an example to illustrate, fairly simply, if we start with this chest X-ray image, and this is our input image, and then if we take that same image and put it onto, in this case, this was a VR display that we measured in the lab, you can see that you have this kind of crosshatch pattern, which is due to a decrease in resolution on the headset. And then it can get even more complicated if you switch from like a VR environment to an AR environment where you add ambient lighting. And now you can see that if we were wanting to see this first feature, it's getting kind of washed out and could be a little bit more challenging to see. And one thing that's also different with the head-mounted displays compared to a conventional monitor is the image quality also varies depending on where you look on the display. So even if you have an image that looks great in the center, as you start to go away from the center, that can really change. And so here's just an example. If you take just a bar pattern and send it into a headset, and then this is a plot of the contrast over the field of view. And you can see once we get to kind of high spatial frequencies, so this would be like small details that you might be trying to find in a medical image, the contrast actually has dropped significantly, and particularly as you go away from the center of the field of view. This is just to say, when you're designing and thinking about how to use these devices, thinking about where the content is within the field of view makes a big difference. Another aspect, which ties into some of the considerations Peter mentioned about, particularly with pediatric cases, is thinking about the importance of the fit on the user and also how that can impact image quality. So one spot that comes up is thinking about the interpupillary distance of the user and how that compares to the head-mounted display. So here's again the same X-ray image. I'm just going to keep carrying this through the whole presentation. And if we start out with kind of like the average person, where a lot of the headsets are designed for an interpupillary distance of 62, image looks pretty good. We still have the resolution decrease, but we expected that. But then if you shift it to 72, which is about where I am, you can see that same area, you end up with a substantial decrease in resolution and contrast. And of course, kids would be on the opposite extreme of that. So really thinking about how the image quality varies with the fit and the user, I think is a very important aspect. So now I'm going to highlight a couple areas that some very recent work that we're doing. And so one of the things we've been taking a look at is for some of the different headsets, looking at the uniformity of the image. So in this case, here's your input image. And then looking on an AR headset, you can see you actually end up with pretty significant image non-uniformity. And then one way that companies will often try to address this, and we worked on a method for doing that here as well, is you can pre-compensate for some of that non-uniformity and take an image that looks like this one in the middle to something that's more like this. And this was simulation based from our measurements, but then when we applied it to this on the HoloLens 2, you can see you go from something like this, where it's very difficult to see, to quite a bit better. Now, I should mention that everything has a trade-off. In this case, since we're doing a software compensation for it, we're losing the maximum luminance or the dynamic range of the device. So another thing I want to highlight real briefly is for thinking about surgical environments. This is something that's probably very familiar to most people, is if we have our ideal case where we want to take a medical image and overlay it with a patient and have our preoperative trajectory that's planned. So what we would ideally like to have is a situation like this, where we have the real world, we have some virtual object, and we can combine the two and they look great. The reality is, since most headsets do not allow for occluding the ambient light or the environment, you end up with something more like this. And this opens up a lot of questions as far as how well can you see the virtual content? So how well could I see this line I want to use as a surgeon? How much have I blocked my view of the surgical field? And how do we understand clinical performance with taking into account these kind of image quality questions? So one step we've started on down this road to understand this is some work that Chuman and Miguel are kind of taking the lead on, is trying to develop task-based models. So starting from the initial image quality measurements that we've done, and then understanding how that would relate to a particular task. So in this case, here's our digital image that we start with, and then you can do measurements on how it looks on a head-mounted display, get some metrics for that. And then in this case, there's a digital target that's being added to the image. It runs through this model, and if you're interested in the details, you can find it in this publication. And then combining all of this, you can get predictions about how a user would perform at being able to identify a target within these images. And so I think there's still a long way to go on going from the bench testing to the clinical outcomes, but these type of task-based models, I think, are a great step forward. Okay, I'm going to highlight a few of the community efforts, and then we'll hopefully have time for questions. One thing I want to highlight is in 2020, we hosted a public workshop, and then with the speakers from that workshop, we put together a consensus paper. It's publicly available. So if you're interested in, I would encourage you to take a look at it. And what this was really trying to do was highlight from the perspective of the speakers and ourselves, what were some of the unanswered questions that need to be addressed in this area. So just pulling a couple tables out of this. So there's a number of image quality questions, both on the spatial and temporal side, and usability questions. And I think these have been highlighted in various forms so far. And then beyond the technical performance, there's also a lot of questions on how you design the clinical part. And there's been a lot of work by researchers in this area on sham control. How do you do blinding? How do you do a comparison with the standard of care to the primary? But anyway, these are kind of just highlighting both on a technical side and a clinical side, what from that workshop, the conclusion was there are some unanswered questions that need additional work from the community. To try to work on some of those, there's a couple of things I want to highlight. So first, there's a MDIC, Medical Extended Reality Working Group. And this one, we've started targeting some of the surgical questions that come up as related to image quality, human factors, and training. And so the first deliverable for that is working on a framework basically that will be publicly available, hopefully in the next few months. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight is from a very different perspective. We also recently hosted a patient engagement committee. There's a lot of great material from this, and I would encourage people to take a look if you're interested in hearing from the panelist perspective about what some of the patient issues are with these devices. And then finally, the other thing I want to mention is once we develop these publications, these methods, there's a question of what do we do with it and how do we get it out there to the public? And the approach that we're taking with that is taking the work one step further than a publication and developing regulatory science tools. So these are publicly available tools that are designed to help both reviewers and medical device companies with some of the evaluation challenges. And so the one I wanted to highlight briefly is one that it's not a regulatory science tool yet, but the code is available if people want to take a look at it. And basically this is a tool that lets you go into WebXR, and with any headset, with a lot of headsets anyway that have website support, you can go in, design test patterns, load up what you want, and then conduct measurements. And so here's just a really brief demonstration of this. So in this case, I'm using the tool, putting a plane in. Now I'm adding in a chest X-ray, changing the color of it, moving where it is in the field of view. And you can see from this graphical interface, it's very easy to change things and add things. Maybe I want a contrast bar. And then once I'm happy with all of that, I can then go down to this AR or this VR button in the corner, push that. And then if I was using it on a headset, you'd be able to see it on the virtual reality headset to do whatever kind of image quality measurements you want to do. With that actually brings me to the end. So I wanted to highlight a couple links that I think are usually helpful for people. QSub program, publicly available access to how you can look up some of these devices. And then also the human factors guidance. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and hopefully we have enough time for some good discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Ryan. I'm very impressed by how much you stayed in time and at the same time really delivered condensed information here. Thank you very much. And as this seminar is also recorded, I'm sure that some of your slides are worth looking at for 5 or 10 minutes while you're pausing it. So I always find it very helpful and also good for our audience if we just go through the questions from the audience. So I will ask them on behalf of the people who actually posted it here. And the first question, I go through it in a chronological order. if I leave out a question, I will also let you know. Like the first question was by Ms. Hellman. What types of mitigations is the FDA expecting to see in submissions for dizziness or fatigue or effect on vision, especially when a consumer headset is used? Maybe, Peter, that's a question you can answer. It was posted during your presentation.
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's definitely going to depend. That's always the answer, right, from FDA, is it depends. It's certainly going to depend from application to application, right? So I think the risk of a device of an adult using a consumer headset at home is going to be different from a child using a consumer headset, is going to be different from a clinician using a custom-built AR/VR headset during surgery, right? So the considerations for how things like dizziness or fatigue or changes in vision, those are going to play out differently in different populations. So I would say it's kind of, I was thinking about this question while Ryan was giving his talk, and I think there's sort of 5 elements to it, right? So one is, or so 4 elements, let me put it that way. So one is clinical data, right? So understanding the nature and extent of those adverse events. Do those events resolve? How many people experience them? Or is a certain population of people that experiences them? Are there long-term effects? Part of it is just getting a handle on what the actual problem is, right? So you think there's a conception of dizziness or fatigue, but actually getting data will actually tell you what the probable risk is. What is the actual risk of this device when it's used clinically? You have questions that you might ask in bench testing about the device technology, the resolution, the quality of the hardware, but that may or may not play out in practice. So once you have that kind of information, I think one of the questions that you could ask is human factors design, right? Can we reduce the effect of these mitigations when we design the software? Perhaps even software that prevents you from overuse or helps you to take a break, right? I think of like a Nintendo machine that every once in a while kind of says, a video game machine that says, don't you want to take a break? Maybe go outside, maybe not play this thing for 3 hours at a time, right? And I think those kinds of things can be helpful to help mitigate the risk of overuse that might lead to some of those adverse events. Sometimes it's about compatibility testing, right? So this is a part where hardware may actually play a role. So, we're not necessarily saying the Oculus or a Samsung Gear VR is a medical device, but obviously somebody's using this product with software on it. And so understanding what the consequences of using different hardware on, maybe certain hardware leads to exacerbated effects, right? And so understanding some of the factors there may be helpful. And then I think obviously labeling, right? Helping people to inform about the benefits and risks of the product, informing a user about how it was tested clinically and what people actually experience so they understand what they might see. And I think ultimately really helping them to understand the device performance in an objective way. And I think that's, one thing I mentioned during the talk is people, a device might be oversold and might underdeliver, right? And so helping a user to understand, what are you actually going to get out of this product? How is this product actually going to benefit you? And what's the risk of that? And a user may decide, a patient may decide to say, hey, they use it a couple of times, they see some benefit, but really they experience a lot of risk. They experience a lot of adverse events. They get a lot of dizziness, and they're like, you know what? This is not worth it for me. And they may, if we can design the labeling and help inform patients well, they might have a better context to understand that and say, hey, maybe this isn't the only treatment, right? This is a treatment that has certain benefits and risks for me, but I need to balance that against my own preferences and what fits into my life. And so all of those things will help to ultimately say, okay, well, when I'm presenting this to FDA, here's the use case that I envision for my product. Here's how I'm going to mitigate some of those risks. Here's how I've tested it and verified it. And I think those are the kinds of mitigations that we would look to see. Not that you can completely make a device 100% safe, that doesn't exist, but that you can say, I do understand the risks, and here's how I plan to control for some of that.
That was an excellent answer. And what I really liked about your answer was that you not just focus on the hardware, but also on the software. And I think we can learn a lot from the gaming industry here, where they have already discovered a lot of patterns which can cause dizziness and cyber sickness. So I think on the software side and the UX side, human factor side, you can actually also mitigate some of these risks. Then short question right after, I think that doesn't take very long to answer. Are there any AR/VR devices that have already been cleared for diagnostic use in radiology? I think this question actually points to the hardware. Maybe the question was intended to see if companies should actually pick one hardware which is already out there and which makes it easier to get cleared by the FDA. Ryan, maybe.
Yeah, maybe Ryan knows the answer to that.
Okay, to try that one. So I'm not aware of an AR/VR device that's cleared specifically for diagnostic use in radiology. But emphasis on that, I'm not aware. There are a number that are used that have been cleared for like for surgery planning. And so, I mean, that can certainly be related, but specifically for diagnostic use in radiology, that's one that I'm not aware of. As far as the hardware, those have come through on a lot of different commercially available platforms. So certainly from Microsoft, Magic Leap, Meta, a lot of different companies, depending again on what the indications for use are. And then that ends up determining what kinds of testing needs to be done.
Yeah, I think from the clinical perspective, like me reviewing CT scans and X-ray scans, I'm a little bit skeptical that a consumer product for $399 can actually get to medical grade right now. I think it requires a very consistent, accurate, and reproducible displays, which are also tracked over time. But I'm really looking forward to see this field develop, and maybe we will see VR or AR devices which are specifically made for the medical field with better displays, higher quality and durable displays. But so far, I'm also not aware of anything which could be a standard, for example. Another question, I think that was during your presentation, Ryan, Daniel Greenberg is asking, what's the difference between rehab and therapy, which was mentioned in your chart?
Yeah, so one caveat on the chart, the table down the left side with the pictographs are ones that I put there. So if you go to like the publicly available information, it wouldn't have the indications for use distilled down to that. In that case, what I was trying to indicate is some of those devices were, for instance, for treating like amblyopia and some vision issues, whereas the rehab device was, I think it was for motion and some of those kind of issues. So that was the distinction I was trying to draw, but that was, again, just my own personal way of categorizing. I'm not meant to be how the FDA views those two.
Okay, then one question for you, Peter, maybe both of you can answer together. How long does it actually take to get an FDA approval? This question was asked by Astrid Tran.
Yeah, so answer is depends. It depends on what your start point is, right? If you're saying I have an idea in my head, but I'm actually going to get it to a medical device, then you're talking, a little bit different timeline. If you're saying if I have a submission ready to submit to the FDA, how long does that take? I would say the general timeline for something like a 510K or a de novo request. So for a 510K, that would be 90 days of FDA review. For a de novo request, that would be 150 days of FDA review. And we may ask questions and give you 6 months to resolve that. So if you had something ready to go, everything's complete and ready to submit to the FDA, potentially you're looking at getting a submission done within a year in terms of having a final decision on that. Now, of course, the actual development process for a medical device can be a lot longer than that. And you may have things like pre-submissions where you're talking to the agency early before you have something ready. So that may add extra time to your submission for sure. But just if you've got something ready to go, it's possible to receive feedback from FDA within a year's time frame.
Okay, thank you very much. Ryan and Peter, you also are able to see the Q&A. I have a little bit of a hard time summarizing the next question. It has a long introduction, and Peter, maybe.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take this one.
I don't want to just read it.
Sure. So this question asked at 12:49 p.m. This is a specific question about a policy that we have around trying to distinguish between areas where FDA is focused on safety and effectiveness and areas where FDA is not going to enforce its authority. And so, for example, thinking of it very broadly, a computer monitor is not something that generally the FDA has a great deal of interest in. It may be displaying medical data, it may be displaying something from software, but it's not necessarily something that FDA is interested in unless it has a direct impact on safety and effectiveness. And I'm very much glossing over some of the subtleties there. So they asked a very specific question based off, and I feel like they're just copying out of a federal law or just out of a guidance document that we have and sort of asking me this direct question. I don't think I can answer that question here. I think I would want to understand, sort of what the context of the question is. And someone's asking for a regulatory statement from FDA. I don't think I can provide that at this point in time. But I appreciate that, it can get very complicated, right? If you have for a certain product overall, there may be some functions which FDA is not really going to consider or not really going to spend its time focusing on. And there may be other tech functions of that device where FDA is really interested. And so it really depends on the specifics.
Thank you very much, Peter. Next question is from Emil, and it's a question related to data privacy and safety, in particular in respect to biometric data. I think this is a very good question coming from a PhD student, because and I can totally feel with this person who asked this question, because we have also done a lot of studies where we looked at biometrical data through eye tracking, virus sensors, EEG, ECG, something called cognitive load, also gaze tracking, reactions, emotion tracking, all of this, facial expression tracking. And the question here, just summarizing it, there is clearly a benefit having all the biometrical data, and there is a significant risk if this data gets lost somewhere or actually transferred to companies who abuse this kind of data. And what Emil is saying, that there are regulations here and guidelines seem to be missing. Peter, Ryan, whoever.
I'm happy to take this question because we get it a lot, actually. So certainly I share that question, that concern about the risk of data privacy being violated or data protection issues where someone's data leaks out. And certainly we care from FDA's perspective. I would say that we really are focused on safety and effectiveness for patients, right? And so safety, we're not trying to interpret safety as broadly as possible. We're really talking about patient health. And so patient data privacy and protection, we have other laws in the United States that help cover that. So most people may have heard of HIPAA, right? That governs how healthcare providers can share information and that kind of thing. But that's not the risk of data being leaked or of data being shared or sold is not a direct safety and effectiveness question for FDA to consider. We're really focused on diagnosing, mitigating, treating, or preventing disease. And so that's really what we're focused on. And so not to say that other laws don't play a part in that, but that's not FDA's focus.
Yeah, I think this is also applies to the European sector here. But I can really understand this worry and it needs to be addressed as well. And also in Germany, authorities are actually looking into this, but not from the regulatory affairs in respect to the medical product just by itself, but there are additional laws which need to be followed, which are really clearly stated, and they are also clear guidelines. And I'm happy to share a link to that if that is needed. Then there is another question by anonymous attendee. I think I can just recite it. What is the first step if we want to get clearance for a mixed reality surgical assistance device? Should we start pre-submission, or you recommend we start with the actual application? Who would be the point of contact for this? I think, Ryan, this is an exact question for you, as you gave talks on this several times.
Yeah, and I think Peter understands this one very, very well, but I think it depends on where you are in the development cycle. But my experience is often if a company comes in with a pre-submission, that can be helpful for both the company and for the FDA to get on the same page and understand the device before coming in with a full submission. So, and as far as point of contact, I can paste in the chat some emails, but there's DICE would be a great place to reach out to for them to direct you with that question. Do you have anything to add to that, Peter, or a different perspective?
Oh, yeah, sure. So the DICE is the Division of Industry and Consumer Education. So that's where you can start there for answers. We also have a management page, which lists all the managers for all the different medical specialties and areas. And so you can try contacting a director there in that group. And they will probably encourage you to submit a pre-submission, but in that case, you could just, say, hey, I want to send it to this person to get their feedback, to get their group's feedback. But a pre-submission process would be the best way to do it, because that means we track and make sure that we answer those questions, and we're not just losing something in an email.
I put the link in the chat. Hopefully people can see the answers.
Thanks, Ryan. Then a quick question. What's the definition when it comes to surgical use of AR/VR devices intraoperative? Like, is there a sub-classification, task-based classification, or does it just mean intraoperative, everything which you use during an operation, for example? Like, did you actually further dissect intraoperative use? I think this goes to risk mitigation and like how risky is it to use the device? At least that's how I understand this question. So I think there shouldn't be more separation regarding intraoperative use, but according to the risk. And also Christian, who asked this question, also said there's probably a difference if you just use it for visualization or actually going through the skin, or even go to the vertebra and place some pellicles. And I think risk is increasing. The device should be more accurate in this case. Or do you have a further separation of the use intraoperative?
I will take that question just briefly. I think the answer is yes. Now, we do differentiate between different levels of risk with respect to that. And what we draw that up in what's called an indications for use statement. That's basically what you propose that your device actually does. And so based on what it's doing, based on the use case that you're proposing, there will be different levels of risk associated with that. And so you can slice it up in specifics, but certainly, yeah, we're going to differentiate that by the level of risk and exposure to the patient there.
Okay. Ryan, I think you can also see this anonymous attendee, 651. What is the timeline you were envisioning between publication and regulatory tool development? I do not quite get this question, but maybe you.
Maybe I do. So if the question is about, so I mentioned that in our development cycle, so we publish a paper and then we try to develop those into regulatory science tools. It's going to depend, of course, on the tool, but certainly maybe like 6 months would probably be on the short end, because the idea of the tool is it should go further than what you do in a publication. So it's really something that's ready to be publicly released and user-friendly, and that requires additional work, documentation, testing, things like that. For the second part of that question, with the WebXR tool, so this is a good question about how would a tool like that be used. So how the tool is going to fit into the regulatory process, of course, is going to depend on the tool. In this case, right now, it's just something that's publicly available. It's not to the point of being a regulatory science tool. The thoughts that I have on how this can be used is, for instance, if I could see it being used by people in a number of different spots during the development cycle. So if you're, for instance, if there's a particular image quality test that needs to be conducted, then that would be something that could be included in that tool, in that suite. And then the sponsor, for instance, could say, yeah, we did this tool. Here's the metric that gets reported out. That would be one way. Another way would be, for instance, for the end user, for using that as if you're in, say, your intended use environment, to make sure that the device has the image quality that you're expecting. And also, I think it's something that could be useful for people on the development side or on the academic side as they're trying to evaluate and characterize some of the performance. So I view it as something that can lower the barrier for people doing some of the image quality testing without having to code everything up themselves. So that was probably more information than you wanted, but that's how I see it fitting in.
Thanks, Ryan. I think, Megan, your question has already been answered. Cybersecurity is an important role for the FDA, so it is for regulatory bodies here in Germany and in Europe, but it's regulated in a separate, different way in combination with these bodies, like Peter already mentioned. And then another question by an anonymous user, is a new application for a current AR/VR device considered de novo or 510K?
Yeah, so as I said, it depends, right? It depends on the extent of what the AR/VR technology is adding, and I would say relative to other devices in that same area. And so if AR/VR is only just being used in a new way to display some information, maybe it could go through the 510K process. If there's really a new risk that's being raised by the device because of its technology, then the de novo process may be a better fit. And so it really depends on what the current landscape is and how that device may differ. And so one way to do that is to come in with a pre-submission and talk about it with us, so we kind of understand how you're expecting your device to be used, and whether or not you're saying, hey, this is really a game changer, this is really something different, or whether you're saying, no, this is really just like the other devices, we're just using AR/VR in this particular application. So it really depends.
All right. I think also the next question asked by Paul Jackson, is there an easy way to understand when FDA approval is required for software using these devices? I think this actually falls into the medical device regulation field and the way how your product and your purpose is actually classified, in which group of medical device it actually falls. Is it a low risk or a high risk? I think that should be covered by that. Peter, Ryan, would you like to add something on that, or?
Just in the interest of time, I'll just say that the medical device definition is whether the product is intended to diagnose, mitigate, treat, cure, or prevent disease. That's really the focus there. And so again, lots of subtleties in that. And so if you have questions, a pre-submission or coming to us with we have a 513G submission is what we call it. And that's where you can request the FDA give you a judgment call on your product. That may be the way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Then directly related to that, is there a publicly available FDA fee schedule?
Yes, so that's information is on our website. So for the submission type, there's a list of the fees that are associated with that. And just to provide an overview of what user fees is. When you submit a submission, certain kinds of submissions, you pay a user fee. By the way, if your device is intended for pediatric use only, there is no user fee. The submission is free to FDA. And in turn, FDA uses those user fees to meet the performance goals that we set, that we negotiate with industry. So we use those fees to hire more staff to meet those goals.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 1 more minute. One question: when it comes to human factor testing, how much is reasonable to do in silico and in the lab versus in a clinical study? I think that really depends on what you want to show. Then this is a very broad question. It really depends.
Right. I would say nothing really beats putting it in front of actual people's hands and getting a sense of how they're actually using the device and what problems they encounter. And we have a whole guidance document that explains how to do human factors testing and what we would expect. And so I would definitely encourage you to search for that on Google and then read that for yourself and learn more about that.
Yeah, and then last question asked by Andrew: assuming hardware for AR, VR becomes very diverse, e.g. like smartphones are now, how important will hardware-specific validation be? Will each model need testing to be in the label? I think before you guys are answering, I think this is definitely what will happen. I mean, right now, I think when companies are out there, they way too often talk about use cases which seem to be very general. But being a clinician, devices really need to be super specific, and then they also need to be rigorously tested for this specific use case. From the clinical perspective, from the regulatory perspective, I think you guys may want to answer that question as well.
Yeah, I can get started on that one. So I would agree with what you said, Lars. So it's important to think about not just the software, but the hardware and how all the components work together for the intended use. And because there's such a wide variety in hardware and the specs change a lot, then it's usually important to consider the specific model, specific hardware that's being used. I mean, you could think about this like if you have a computer and you're using it on like a high-end machine versus a tablet, how the software performs is going to be quite different. It's more so with the AR, VR because there's a lot of changes in the display, sensors, and all of that, which all impacts how well it performs. So yeah, the two go hand in hand.
Right, and I would say, you could see a point down in the future where the hardware is a commodity enough that, hardware-specific validation is maybe not necessary or is not that helpful, or you could tailor the validation that's needed. But it really will depend on, depends on our understanding of the technology, right? And I think it's a burgeoning field where we're all trying to work together and figure out, what aspects or specifications are most important. And tailoring our requirements around that, so we're not asking for more than we need to be able to make a decision.
Yeah, I think that there was a really good last question, and I think especially this question also shows that this industry is more mature than it used to be 6 years ago, and now we really go into the details, into the specific use cases, and now it's really important to that more research follow. And thank you very much, Ryan and Peter, for helping us in this quite complicated area of medical device regulation in a niche area like medical XR. Thank you very much. And thank you, Stephen, for organizing this wonderful series.
It's my pleasure. And I have to repeat your thanks to Peter and Ryan and emphasize what's so positive about it is the FDA is doing outreach to the innovators so that they can understand one another in this new field, new and growing field, and you really see it in that there's an opportunity to pre-apply and get feedback before investing in an approval to get their opinion, and that I think is really wonderful. I also want to thank you, Lars. We found that having domain experts as a moderator makes the talks much better, and you confirm that. I just want to take a minute to tell you about the talks that we have coming up. We have on November 9th, I hope you're seeing that. Are you seeing Wellness and Therapeutic VR? Yes, okay, good.
Yep.
So we have a session on use cases and results of wellness and therapeutic applications. These are pretty interesting. We've got some interesting companies, a domain-specific moderator, of course, but we'll have TRIP, Neuro Rehab, and Mirion in touching on a couple of subfields here. This should be a really interesting session. It's on our website. You can register. Not yet on our website is on November 30th. We'll have the Innovator's Journey from XR Health. And then on the 19th of December, we have the Army's project to use augmented reality to have surgeons remotely help medics in the field. Very interesting paper, and we've got an interesting a couple of speakers and a wonderful moderator. So with that, I'll thank our audience. Look forward to joining us again. And again, Lars, Ryan, and Peter, thank you. Great talk, and I'm sure the recording will be used quite often. Thank you.
Thank you.